In one country, brand new skyscrapers tower over empty streets. Entire neighborhoods stand vacant, lights off at night. In another, families crowd under corrugated tin roofs, streets overflowing with life. One has built cities for nobody, the other can't house its own people. It's a tale of two housing crises, China and India, mirror opposites on the urban spectrum. Welcome to the housing paradox. China has too many homes, and India has too few. In China, you'll find ghost cities with more apartments than residents. In India, you'll find slums where 10 people share one room. It's a contrast that feels almost upside down, and it's happening right now, in the two most populous countries on Earth. Let's start with the paradox itself. China has built more homes than it needs, while India hasn't built nearly enough. A few quick stats paint the picture. By some estimates, China may have 65 to 80 million vacant apartments, possibly even more. One former Chinese official said 1.4 billion people, China's entire population, probably can't fill all the empty homes. In other words, China has entire extra cities worth of housing. Meanwhile, India has an acute housing shortage. A government-backed study found India's urban housing deficit was about 19 million units in 2012, mostly affecting low-income families. By 2018, that shortage had ballooned to 29 million homes. Think about that. Tens of millions of Indian families lack adequate housing, even as tens of millions of Chinese homes sit empty. Why does this matter now? Because both countries are at a critical moment. China's property boom has turned to bust. Big developers are defaulting, home prices are shaky, and growth is slowing. The housing glut is colliding with a shrinking population, raising fears of a long economic hangover. India, on the other hand, has just become the world's most populous country and is urbanizing rapidly. Its cities are swelling with people seeking opportunity, but many end up in slums or cramped informal housing. This housing crunch affects health, safety, and economic potential in India's metros. In short, China's empty homes and India's housing shortfall are ticking time bombs, each threatening their country's future in different ways right now. How did we get here? To understand the paradox, we need to look at the origins, the mechanisms that led China to overbuild and India to underbuild. It comes down to policy choices, economic incentives, and some quirks of history in each country. In China, the story starts with an economic boom and a unique system of land and finance. China's government owns all urban land and leases it to developers. Starting in the late 1990s and 2000s, local governments in China grew hooked on selling land rights as a source of revenue. In fact, by 2019, about 38% of all local government income came from land sales and land-backed loans. That's huge. Imagine your city funding nearly half its budget by auctioning off land to the highest bidder. This gave local officials a strong motive to keep selling land and encouraging development. The more land they sold, the more money they had to build roads, subways, and schools, fueling GDP growth and often boosting their own careers. It was a build model. At the same time, Chinese households developed an appetite for property as an investment. Remember, in China, there are limited avenues to invest savings. Capital controls keep money mostly at home. Real estate became the go-to store of wealth. By 2023, roughly 70% of Chinese household wealth is tied up in property. For many families, buying an apartment, or two or three, was seen as the safest way to preserve and grow wealth. This frenzy was fed by the belief that home prices only go up, and by easy credit during boom years. Developers raced to supply new units to meet this speculative demand. People bought apartments they didn't plan to live in, just to flip or hold as empty investments, believing the value would rise. So you had local governments pushing land sales, banks lending to developers, and citizens snapping up multiple homes. The result? Mass construction. Whole new districts and cities sprung up almost overnight. Crucially, many of these new developments were built in anticipation of future growth. The government's urbanization drive meant building new cities in interior provinces and smaller towns. Tier 3 and 4 cities, less wealthy, lesser-known places, saw a construction binge. Nearly 80% of China's housing stock was built in these lower-tier cities, which ironically have experienced slower population and income growth. In some cases, cities built far more housing than there were people moving in. One famous example is Ordos in Inner Mongolia. The new Kangbashi district was planned for 1 million residents, but for years it remained eerily underpopulated, earning the nickname Ghost City. There are dozens of such ghost cities across China, shiny urban skylines with high vacancy rates. By 2017, China's nationwide urban housing vacancy was estimated around 20%. For comparison, that's double the natural vacancy rate in the US. This overbuilding was no accident. It was baked into the Chinese growth model. India's housing crisis, on the other hand, has roots in opposite conditions: scarcity driven by restrictive laws, outdated policies, and chaotic urban planning. For decades after independence, India's approach to cities was influenced by a kind of socialist-controlled mindset. Land and housing were heavily regulated. Several archaic laws played a part. One was the Urban Land Ceiling Act of 1976, which sought to cap land ownership in cities to prevent hoarding. In practice, it locked up land in litigation and red tape, discouraging development. The law was eventually scrapped in the 1990s, but damage was done. Then there were old rent control laws, like the Bombay Rent Act of 1947, which froze rents at 1940s levels for years. Great for long-time tenants, but landlords stopped building or maintaining rental housing because it wasn't profitable, meaning less new housing came onto the market for newcomers. Policies like these inadvertently stifled formal housing supply and pushed more people into informal settlements. Perhaps the biggest culprit is urban planning rules that severely limit housing density. Indian cities historically had some of the world's most restrictive building codes. For example, Mumbai, India's financial capital, imposed a ridiculously low floor space index, FSI, also known as FAR, floor area ratio, for decades. Until 2018, much of Mumbai had an FSY of only 1.33 for residential buildings. To put that in perspective, Manhattan is commonly zoned for an FAR of 10 or more, and Shanghai and Singapore often exceed 8 to 15. Mumbai's 1.33 meant developers could only build 1 square foot of floor space for each square foot of land. The result? The city spread outward, but buildings stayed low-rise despite sky-high demand. This artificial cap choked the housing supply in a city of over 12 million people. In fact, Mumbai is an extreme case where about half of the population lives on just 12% of the land, largely in slums, because rules prevented building upward. Other cities had similar, if not as draconian, FSY limits. The intent was to control congestion, but it ended up forcing people into slums by limiting formal housing growth. Another issue is land title and acquisition. In India, land ownership records can be messy, and acquiring land for development has been notoriously difficult. Decades of unclear titles and legal disputes mean developers fear projects getting bogged down in courts. Government projects to build housing often stall because someone challenges the ownership of a plot. Even today, a huge number of civil court cases in India relate to property and land disputes. This lack of clear, transferable land rights has constrained the formal housing market. So has the slow pace of urban infrastructure. Often, new housing projects are delayed waiting for basic services, water, sewage, roads, to catch up. By the mid-2010s, both countries' housing models, oversupply in China and undersupply in India, were reaching a breaking point. Let's look at the turning point events that forced each country to confront its housing reality. China's wake-up call came when the property bubble finally started to deflate. The poster child is Evergrande, once China's second-largest property developer. Evergrande had expanded aggressively, building apartments across dozens of cities, many in those speculative ventures we mentioned. By 2021, Evergrande was swimming in debt, over $300 billion owed, and struggling as the government tightened borrowing rules. That year, Evergrande defaulted on its debt payments, a shocking development in a sector long propped up by easy credit. Homebuyers who had paid deposits panicked, construction on many projects halted, and the news sent tremors through China's financial system. Evergrande wasn't alone. Other big developers like Country Garden soon teetered on the edge of default. What triggered this crash? In 2020, Beijing had introduced the 3 red lines policy to curb developer leverage, basically telling firms like Evergrande, reduce your debt or no more loans. After years of overbuilding and overborrowing, the music stopped. The property sector, which made up roughly a quarter of China's economy, went into a tailspin. As developers cracked under debt, new building ground to a halt, and many partially built estates were just abandoned. By late 2023, developers accounting for 40% of China's housing sales had defaulted on debts. The combined floor area of unsold new homes hit nearly 650 million square meters, roughly 7.2 million unsold apartments. And that doesn't even count the millions of sold but vacant units. Essentially, China's long property boom had finally overreached. The government's attempt to prick the bubble before it got even bigger led to a rapid unraveling of the house of cards. For the first time in a generation, Chinese home prices have been falling in many cities, and consumer confidence was shaken. With so much of household wealth in property, this downturn made people feel poorer, and they cut back spending, contributing to China's economic malaise. The specter of Japan-style stagnation, or worse, a financial crisis, loomed. In short, the ghost homes came back to haunt China's economy. The overbuilding model hit its limit when the speculative demand could no longer keep up and the debts came due. India's housing crisis broke more slowly, as a social crisis rather than a sudden financial crash. By the 2010s, it was clear that the existing approach was failing millions of urban residents. Slums continued to expand in all major cities. Take Dharavi in Mumbai, often called Asia's largest slum. Roughly 1 million people crammed into 2.6 square kilometers. Living conditions in such slums are extremely challenging. Limited access to clean water, sanitation, or secure housing. Other cities have similar stories. Delhi's slum clusters, Kolkata's busties, etc. The sheer scale of urban poverty and inadequate housing was impossible to ignore. It reached a point where even the middle class felt the strain, with rent in formal housing climbing and more people pushed to informal colonies. A few events highlighted the breaking point. Large fires and floods in slums, tragedies that killed residents and left thousands homeless, made headlines, underscoring how unsafe these settlements were. For example, slum communities in Delhi have seen repeated fires. One resident in Delhi told reporters his slum home burned down 8 times over the years. Meanwhile, government efforts to remove or beautify cities by demolishing slums, especially ahead of high-profile events like the Commonwealth Games or, recently, the G20 summit, left many uprooted without alternatives. The human toll of underhousing became stark. Families living under bridges after evictions, or 10 people to a room during COVID-19 lockdowns, making social distancing impossible. In Delhi alone, as of 2021, around 6.7 million people lived in low-income informal housing, slums, unauthorized colonies, etc. That's nearly a third of the capital's population. Nationwide, the number of homeless or inadequately housed was rising with urban migration. By the mid-2010s, India's leaders recognized that the slum proliferation and housing shortage were hampering the country's development. It wasn't just a humanitarian issue, but an economic one. How can India's cities drive growth if a huge portion of workers live in substandard conditions? The stage was set for a major policy response, which we'll discuss in What's Next. Now we have the background. China built too much, India too little. What have been the consequences of these opposite housing crises? Let's put them side by side. It's a study in contrasts, but also in some surprising similarities. We'll also tackle an intriguing question. Is it better to overbuild and have ghost cities, or underbuild and have slums? What are the trade-offs? Visually, the difference is striking. In China's ghost cities, you see modern infrastructure without people, 4-lane roads with no traffic, apartment complexes where only a few windows are lit at night. One could film a post-apocalyptic movie in some of these places and hardly need to edit. There are reports of entire districts with occupancy rates in the single digits. In India's slums, you see the opposite. People without modern infrastructure, narrow lanes bustling with children, street vendors, makeshift electric lines, homes jerry-built from plywood and tarps. Life spills into every open space because living quarters are so cramped. These are cities teeming with activity, but lacking proper housing, sanitation, and space. The ghost city is a symbol of wasted resources. The slum is a symbol of unmet needs. China spent vast sums to build apartments and cities that, for now, people aren't using. India saved resources by not building enough, but the cost is millions living in substandard conditions. It's almost a cruel irony. If we could magically teleport some of China's excess apartments to India, we might solve problems for both sides. But economics and logistics don't work that way, of course. So, what are China and India doing now to address these issues, and what lies ahead? Both countries know they have a problem and are taking steps, albeit very different ones, to course correct. Let's look at the prospects and scenarios for each. China's focus now is to manage the deflation of its housing bubble and prevent an outright crash. This is a delicate dance. The government has already taken several actions. They've eased some restrictions from the 3 red lines now that developers are in trouble, basically trying to give developers breathing room to restructure debts. Interest rates have been cut to stimulate borrowing. Banks have been nudged to extend credit or roll over loans to struggling projects so that construction can be completed. One mantra is, ensure homes are delivered to angry presale buyers. In big cities like Beijing and Shanghai, authorities have relaxed home purchase restrictions. For example, treating a family who paid off a previous mortgage as a first-time buyer eligible for lower down payments, to spur demand. There are also discussions about introducing a nationwide property tax eventually, which could discourage speculative holding of empty apartments. But that's politically sensitive and has been repeatedly delayed. One buzzword is destocking, essentially encouraging the sale of unsold homes. Some local governments are offering subsidies or tax breaks to home buyers, especially in smaller cities, to clear the inventory. In an almost ironic twist, a few city governments have themselves started buying empty apartments or seizing from bankrupt developers to convert into public housing or rental units. The idea is to put these empties to use and provide affordable rentals for young people who can't afford to buy, thus tackling 2 problems at once. How much this will happen remains to be seen, but pilot programs are in discussion. The phrase, "houses are for living, not for speculation," has been a government slogan in recent years, indicating a policy shift. Beijing would like to gradually wean the economy off its housing addiction. The best-case scenario for China? A soft landing. Housing prices slowly adjust downward or sideways over several years, while incomes catch up. Unsold inventory gets gradually absorbed or repurposed, and the financial system is backstopped to prevent collapses. Under this scenario, maybe by mid-2030s the excess is worked off, and the market stabilizes at a sustainable supply-demand balance. The worst case? A sharp housing crash that causes a banking crisis or major loss of household wealth confidence. A spiral of falling prices leading people to default or stop buying. Local governments going bankrupt due to lack of land sale revenue, and a prolonged recession. The kind of thing Japan faced in the 1990s, but potentially bigger. The base case somewhere in between is more likely, a period of low growth and stagnant housing activity while the government intervenes here and there to prop up critical pieces. Remember, China also faces demographic headwinds. The population is aging and started declining, meaning long-term housing demand may not ever reach those lofty forecasts developers once had. So China might end up demolishing some unneeded buildings or converting them to other uses over time. The era of frenetic building is over. Now it's about digesting the glut. India, confronted with its under-housing reality, has pivoted to aggressively build affordable housing in recent years. The flagship initiative is Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, PMAY, launched in 2015 with the bold promise of housing for all. Under PMA Urban, the government set out to enable construction of about 11 to 12 million affordable urban housing units by around 2022. This involves subsidies for low-income homebuyers, partnerships with private developers to build cheaper units, and slum redevelopment programs. How has it fared? As of the early 2020s, the scheme has made progress, but also faced challenges. By 2023, the government had sanctioned around 1.2 crore, 12 million urban houses, and roughly 73 to 85 lakh, 7.3 to 8.5 million, had been completed. So, a majority of the target has been or is being built, but some units are still under construction or delayed, and a gap remains. They even extended the timeline to 2024 to 2025 to finish the rest. In rural areas, a parallel PMA Rural has built over 20 million simple houses, helping slow the flow of rural migrants a bit by improving village housing. Besides government-built housing, there's an effort to reform regulations. Many cities have started to raise FSY limits to allow taller buildings, especially around transit nodes. Mumbai, for instance, now allows up to FSY 3 or more in some areas, still modest by global standards, but a step up from 1.33. There's also a realization that redeveloping slums in situ, on the same land, is crucial, basically turning slums into formal apartments without uprooting communities far away. The Dharavi redevelopment project is one high-profile example. The plan is to invest approximately $2.4 billion to rebuild Dharavi's shanties into high-rise flats and infrastructure, with private developer Adani Group recently winning the contract. Each eligible slum family would get a small apartment in the new development, free of cost, while the developer gets a portion of land to build commercial projects to sell. Such schemes have been tried before on smaller scales, with mixed success, but Dharavi is a big test case. Other cities like Delhi and Chennai also have slum rehab projects underway. For India, a best-case scenario would be a kind of housing renaissance, continuing to build millions of affordable homes, successfully upgrading slums into safe neighborhoods, and implementing policies like higher FSI and easier building permits to let the private sector mass-produce housing. If done right, India could catch up with housing demand in a decade or two, improving living standards and unlocking economic gains. Imagine healthier, more productive urban citizens. The worst case would be if urban population growth outpaces construction and reforms. Then slums might actually expand further, and housing costs could skyrocket, making cities less livable. Additionally, poorly executed redevelopment could lead to social issues, e.g., if slum dwellers are forced to distant outskirts, losing livelihoods. The base case is likely that India will make steady, if uneven, progress. Some cities will effectively reduce slums and add housing, while others may lag. Political will and governance will play a big role. One encouraging sign is that housing is now a mainstream topic in Indian policy, whereas 20 years ago, it wasn't as high on the agenda. There's recognition that without decent housing, you can't have inclusive growth.